Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are just freestyling a bit, but you might see some different characters than usual, and character select is off on top of that. So, be prepared for weird things. Part of the reason for this is because some people need some extra practice, and part of the reason for it is because Kazuki Nicely really needs to relax her style today, and being able to reach from half screen with the kunai is kind of helpful in a specific thing that she needs to work on. Staying calm in neutral, poking at the mid game, while understanding that you can't always defeat your opponent by hitting buttons. And Ibuki, while being very good at pressure, isn't actually good at winning by hitting buttons. Her buttons have properties that make them hard to use for just, I'm going to suppress you now, or I'm going to outrange you now, making it harder for her to do the same sorts of things she normally does, and she'll have to stay calmer in mid-range. From the other side, we have Santier, who basically knows how to deal with this type of player, but normally has problems reaching the position required, and has been practicing some other things that really help, even more so in this matchup than most others. Understanding when to dash, for example, when your opponent probably isn't going to be ready, and when you can use things like Ibuki's hopping attacks to get into position, are really good practice points, but unlike most of it, they require a lot of precision in terms of understanding the opponent's flow. So more or less today, she's placed in the situation where every hit has to actually count, where you can't do something to get pushback or so that your opponent blocks it, because you can't get advantage that way anymore. Understanding that certain characters in this game, no matter how good they are, don't get advantage by forcing the opponent to block buttons at mid-range is important for deciding how you as a person want to play. But if she does tend to stand her ground often enough, and in this case that's probably fine, because unlike Karine where you actually need to backdash in certain situations, Ibuki doesn't really have to do this as much. She can outright avoid certain scenarios with certain buttons, certain angles. But again, it's all about making sure that when you make a decision, you're fairly sure it's going to work.
You lose.
Today's lounge doesn't have a decided tweet yet. I'm probably going to be thinking about that for the next couple of minutes. It will go out though. It is more or less an Atlantic Rim lobby. Europe is okay, Midwest is okay if your internet is good. Caribbean down to Latin America and northern parts of South America. Give it a shot if your internet is good, you don't mind a little lag. If you don't, one thing you can definitely see already coming back into her mind is the fact that sometimes you need to just do that. You need to just move because you think your opponent is going to, but you don't have to beat their buttons. You just have to get through. You can go into the air and avoid them while striking them, or you use her Kasumigake to get into position, or you just straight up dash up, but that's not usually the better option. Ibuki has a lot of ways of getting out of the way of attacks, and using those
Round 2.
helps with the fact that she's not the greatest in I'm going to stick out buttons and win if it's easy. It's also good training for stopping your strings and combos at different timings, guessing how your opponent's going to react after a little bit, etc. Which comes back to something we were training or having her train before. Figuring out when your opponent thinks it's their turn. Because if your character is good at making them wrong, you can use it one way, and if they're not, then you still can use it. You still know how to defend yourself, when to prepare for certain things, and so on. Characters with invincible moves, or really powerful evasion abilities, often have to decide this because those abilities are often unsafe. If your opponent thinks it's their turn, you use your evasion. If they don't think it's their turn, and you do something, there's a good chance that you're going to get hit because they'll keep defending or blocking, and then you will be extremely unsafe because whatever option you chose, by nature, is unsafe.
You lose.
This means she's going to be spending some time thinking through how to put herself in the right spaces. And once there, the feeling of the match, more or less. We have what looks like a rookie Zeku. Are they actually going to play this match? Generally, again, don't generally pay too much attention to Suntier's bars. Sometimes it actually is bad, but most of the time, you should assume that that 2 bar doesn't mean anything. In fact, we generally set this to 3 to 5 bars and they still allow the join, so if you can't join, that is why. There is in fact a restriction on this, but you'll see it when you try to. You're looking for, of course, Rune Siren. It is 3 rounds first to 2 with character select off. And the lounge is quite large and full, so if you are planning to join it, we don't have a whole lot of plans of dropping to back today. So you should definitely prepare for a long haul, or maybe sit this one out depending on how you feel about it. But we are at Zeku and Akuma. Matches like this are always complex, and if this person is what we tend to call a zero beast, it's going to be even worse. But there's no way to judge that right away, especially not since we don't know when we're going to know the information on the lag melt.
Fight.
But one of the most obvious things that a Zeku will do, if they know what they're doing, is really precisely spaced ram. We have discussed in the past that Zeku's evasive maneuvers don't generally work too well if you're very prepared for the anti-air. He does have some really good jump arcs, but he doesn't have a lot of really great ways to get there against characters who have good anti-airs. If your anti-airs aren't so great, then you're going to have to really pressure and push down and backdash and find your way through footsies, navigating the maze of Zeku's attacks. But for a character of this type, mostly you just have to be ready to anti-air with uppercut, probably. It doesn't have to be uppercut either. Akuma's air fireball helps even more in that regard, because he can get around a lot of things Zeku wants to do simply by choosing the correct timing for the move. I can't tell if it's laggy or not. I'd presume so.
Akuma wins.
Well, let's try to get that tweet out, actually.
Let's do this.
It's a little bit easier to know whether or not this one is laggy.
Round one. Fight.
But these two don't get to play that often, and fighting Abigail is really different than fighting most other characters in this game. He barely jumps. He can do things that are effectively similar to jumps without jumping. His spacing means that frame data is variable at best. And even if you learn all of the reactions required for everything he does, being sure that you're at the right spacing for any of the specific methods can be really difficult. Add to that just the fact that you're not used to having to use this much output. Like, it doesn't come up often when you think about it, but you literally have to have more meter in order to beat Abigail on any given match. It's really subtle, but it makes a big difference sometimes. If your character is used to being able to beat up on other characters while still having meter left over, Abigail's defense is just about good enough that you don't get to, you know, sit on meter most of the time, but you actually have to probably do maybe one or sometimes two more mix-ups or interactions just to get the win, meaning you'll eat up more of your own meter to do it. If you've got good control of a situation, it tends to help. But Akuma's not that type of character most of the time. He has a lot of options, but not quite the same type of control required to do it. And unfortunately, he must often fight from the range where Abigail's back heavy punch will cause a lot of problems. That move retracts Abigail's hurt box quite a bit at the beginning compared to most other things, and therefore doesn't tend to trade even if it's hit in similar timings, making it one of Abigail's better close range neutral tools. It also has interesting amounts of pushback and a bunch of other really useful properties. The rest is armor.
Looks like I've got more horsepower.
Round two.
A really experienced and daring Abigail player will absolutely understand which moves they can armor through and in which ways. This is similar to what we've seen previously with some stuff from Rika and work related to using her V-skill. Understanding exactly how much space you have for certain armored attacks, the frame data of your opponent, and whether or not they'll be able to land the second or third hit of their attack before your attack goes off. For the most part, armored moves in this game are designed to be able to go through a lot of things with some application of your skill or luck. Most of them don't have a big gap. Your opponent has to be able to see you coming a little too well. This problem is going to probably be exacerbated, assuming this match doesn't lag terribly, by the fact that Ed doesn't really have a lot of good responses to Abigail's armor. In fact, Ed has exactly one extremely good response and basically nothing else after that. You can't just use armor against Ed mid-screen most of the time because the player can react with his V-skill, and I believe this just always works. They don't even have to charge it, if I remember correctly, but I'm not sure about that one. The point is, though, that you definitely get a lot of moments where Ed wants to hang out in neutral just outside of Abigail's range, hit stand medium kick or something, maybe jump if nothing's going on, hit stand heavy punch but not actually charge it, those sorts of things. Getting anything else to work is relatively difficult, because while Psycho Spark can be used, most Abigail players will manage to get through the Psycho Spark and can do so in a lot of ways. They can do it proactively, they can do it by parrying certain things, and so on. Ed's better options for this matchup mostly involve dashing back in and out of situations, and more or less hitting heavy punch. If you've got good timings for your heavy punch hit, then you're in a good place. If you've got good spacings for your heavy punch hit, you're in an even better place. One useful thing of this matchup is that Psycho Spark can be used as an additional deterrent for Abigail just hitting buttons in neutral, but without the actual projectile part. So you can just walk up to him and hit Psycho Spark, because the way that the move gets back, pulls your stuff back, and so on, tends to help. Yeah, see this sort of thing. It can actually feel like a fairly oppressive match, because until you get really good at Ed, you don't get too much of the things most people are used to doing or thinking about. And the rhythm of it is therefore very different from normal fights. One thing to remember about why you can use the heavy punch is that Abigail's normals are usually slow enough that having your own move that lets you pull back your hurt box for variable amounts of time can be really helpful. Abigail can't usually just hit buttons at close range, and if he does, you'll get hit by light punches and pushed back a little bit, and you can just backdash out of that. You've got a lot of good options if your spacing is right. Just hit the heavy punch, even if you're in a pressure string, because this is one of the few characters where you can just do that. The pushback from the heavy punch is what you're aiming for most of the time. Fresh counter when Abigail thinks that he has no distance bonus helps just as much, but this is a far-reaching move. It's not particularly obvious because it doesn't look like it's doing that much, but just like Balrog IE Boxer, you get a lot out of this. It's not quite Chun-Li stand heavy punch level, but it's rather far. And you can use it therefore to cover a lot of space for yourself by just hitting it and expecting it to push Abigail to a position where Abigail's normals don't really help as much anymore.
Round 2.
Abigail generally tends to want to get a little closer to Ed than Ed wants Abigail to be, and the heavy punch helps deal with that part of the situation. Also, it's not a particularly easy move to whiff punish despite being just a stand heavy punch. That said, a lot of this comes down to the other benefit it gives you. You get a lot of meter just off using this move. You get a lot of V meter when it does crush counter. And that sort of thing can be really important for Ed's play, particularly in getting out of the corner. Abigail is thankfully not a character that's terribly good at beating V reversals. He's normally hitting from so far away that there's no chance of having a bait and throw, and tends to use really heavy normals with big recovery. Meaning that if you do block your way through a situation, you're not really being pressured per se, but you might still want to be reversal out if you find yourself pushed too close to the corner. And there's that stand knee kick, which also does a really good job in these situations when you feel I could get better. But it's the power of the boxer. Ed doesn't really care that much what Abigail is doing at any given point on the screen, because Ed can always maneuver around Abigail's movement. It's always important to think about whether or not your character, or rather your opponent's character, whether or not their main ways of keeping you honest usually that explosive.
Let's do this.
Now this match we've covered multiple times. Things Necalli cares about: stomp, dive kick, sometimes stand medium punch. Things Abigail cares about: forward heavy punch, stand heavy punch, parries.
Round one.
Other than that, this is more or less a standard fight. Necalli can't easily get into the zone he really wants to, but once Abigail has gotten an advantage, it doesn't tend to stick very long. So there's actually a lot of small damage footsie style interactions here, with one of the main issues that Necalli has being that he can't get into position right. Most characters can deal with Necalli's approaches by doing jumps, but Abigail can't. The jumps won't do the job, and if he tries to do something like just go for giant flip, it's unlikely to come out as useful. But you see this comes up quite a lot. There's the walk down moment that gets there, but once you've gotten into the walk down, there must be some really fast reactions from Abigail's side to get the anti-airs correct, because you have to hit with the forward heavy punch or crouch heavy punch within a really short time frame compared to most of the other things that are done. You can't quickly parry because dive kick might delay things, and you can't instantly go for stand light punch because not only will you do very little damage, Necalli will probably come out of any scramble that creates in more or less the situation he was probably looking for. One decent option that Abigail does have is the ability to just run at certain times and then parry whatever Necalli chooses to do. But with this V skill and V trigger combination, eventually even that will get shut down.
Necalli wins.
A good option therefore to force the Necalli player to stay more defensive and never get up to these sorts of shenanigans is to spend a little of your health bar on medium and heavy giant clip. They can of course counter these moves, it's not even difficult, but the amount of effort it takes for them to spend time thinking about this as opposed to the amount of damage they get from doing so really helps, because it keeps changing Abigail's position. And by changing your position, a lot of the things Necalli is counting on in this matchup stop working. The stand heavy kick is also good, but it falls a little short because it doesn't really deal with Necalli when he jumps unless you've chosen the right time. So you can see it here. One of the heavier things that Amara is going for isn't so much can I not get hit, but can I make sure that when I get hit, you don't know where I am. Sitting and blocking lets Necalli set up his situations as he prefers, and sometimes, if you've already convinced them to do a different thing, that might work out for you. But a lot of the time, you just need to use some of that huge health Abigail has when your opponent isn't too capable yet of throwing out big damage, to just make it too stressful for them to know where you are. Because this character has too many options, too many good block strings, is generally too good in scrambles to just be letting him do as he likes. When you find the player has retreated too much, it's a good option to just whiff Abigail's crouch, well, rather down forward heavy kick, and roll at them. Not specifically because you want to do anything with the roll, but again, Necalli's whiff punishes, while good, rely a lot on his meter level. And any back jumps, as you can see there, end up in really weird situations. The secondary part of this then is that once you've gotten into weird positions, then your anti-airs all work. Because a lot of what Necalli needs to do involves setting up situations where he has all the time in the world to fiddle with the ranges to make sure that you at least misdirection a little bit. Helps a lot to have Crawling Beast for that, where you have to watch two things on the screen. Maybe did a normal with a weird recovery. Down forward heavy punch helps, and then immediately jump. All sorts of little things there help. Even jump back, jump forward is a meaningful thing here. But once Abigail has started to move his own position a lot, even if you get hit, it tends to make Necalli's jumps a lot more predictable and a lot more both parryable and forward heavy punch, or even the stand light punch coming out as a better option because it changes the way things interact. As an Necalli player, therefore, a lot of what you're aiming for here is getting enough control to get throws and get ahead in damage enough that you don't have to worry about a ton of weird things in neutral happening. More advanced Abigail players will probably notice that you can easily use, as I noted, other people, like if you expect Necalli to come forward in a certain way, you do this. If you deal with him in jumping a certain way, you do that. But the fact that Abigail can use the roll to go under situations where Necalli is going to jump at least allows for a reset in the mid-range. This isn't supposed to be a way of escaping, but rather there's a specific space on the screen where your opponent is either going to probably back jump or backdash, or jump at you. And in that situation, just roll. Most of the time, it's fine. This is particularly effective when you've gotten far enough to actually have V-meter, so that your opponent is waiting for you to roll incorrectly, maybe even trying to set up the incorrect roll, but because roll's animation is so long, and you can V-cancel it really late, they don't get much out of this. By the time you have made a mistake, you could just cancel your own mistake. But here we can see something slightly more helpful happening from the wolf side, getting in to get the throws. Unfortunately, chunky now Abigail's health with throws alone
Abigail wins.
is a lot. Here we expect to see a different V skill, and honestly, this, aside from a slight difference in timing, Abigail's strategy doesn't change that much. When Nakali has advantage and might just go for the seismo as we call it, it seems reasonable to expect that you'll be hit out of giant flip, because you will. Therefore, you can't generally use this as a method of dealing with Nakali when you're the one too far away or that have been knocked down or similar. Interestingly, rolling might help even more there. But when Nakali has been put on the back foot and isn't quite sure of what Abigail will do, two things work here. Specifically, run into avalanche and giant flip in relatively neutral situations. In fact, whenever Nakali hits a button and doesn't have full meter, giant flip is a good option then, for the same reason. You can see it causes certain things to whiff, and otherwise makes just annoyances happen. Since Nakali doesn't have a lot of multi-hit moves that will shut Abigail down in ways that he cares about, the finesse required to actually use the V skill to hurt him gets kind of rough. You can absolutely do it, and in fact, you could generally consider it part of your strategy simply to build up enough V meter to overwhelm the character in some other way. But it's not going to get you as far unless you've gotten control of a situation like this one and just found the right time to keep doing it. But since Abigail can block his way through all of it, it's a good way to just get you to this, because this helps. So the main helpful aspect of this V skill over the other is that you can force Abigail to block this way more often than you can force him to block Crawling Beast. And that puts him in this situation. The two combined are an actual zoning strategy. Slightly mistimed on Wiki. I'm not sure what would have happened, actually, because that move is kind of hard to counter with the timing, since Abigail can do it quite late. You will also note that something comes up whenever Abigail does block that move. You can almost always either giant flip or roll directly after that move has come out, assuming you blocked it. This is not going to hit your opponent most of the time, but it is going to reset your situation enough that you care. Never underestimate the knockdown options Abigail has after EX Avalanche. Because while with every other character it's, oh, I ended up really far away, I can probably be fine. This is the one character who will knock you that far away and still reach. Not even Dalsim does this that way, because Dalsim's normals at that point don't really help that much, and honestly it takes too long to animate relative to the knockdowns Dalsim tends to get. There are a couple, so don't go messing with it and saying I said something that covers all situations, but you'll see it from Abigail a lot more often than Dalsim. But Dalsim can teleport, which is a whole thing unto itself. Since Nakali doesn't have a particularly floaty jump, and this is something that you learn very slowly as an Abigail player, whose back jump actually gets the amount of avalanche versus not, because it does differ by character. It's also, of course, influenced by where they were trying to stand in the first place. And pure freestyle. Bulldogging through non-lateral projectiles or non-lateral zoning is actually something Abigail's quite good at. Most characters can do this a little more quickly than Abigail can, but if you put out the amount of damage reward for a success that Abigail does, obviously.
Looks like I've got more horsepower.
Final round. Fight.
Caught in the headlights again. Oh, didn't get stuck. And that was a miss input of probably the closest size move. But again, always remember, Abigail has a lot of momentum on moves. He isn't always exactly where you think he is, especially in terms of hurt boxes and hitboxes. This is why our Abigail bot is built the way it is, to precisely teach you just through experience of throwing stuff at this character and seeing what sticks, whether or not the things you think will work consistently do so.
Let's do this.
We've had one or two discussions of the Abigail versus Ibuki matchup before as well. Mainly the issue is that Ibuki is too hard for Abigail to catch, and Abigail's attacks are very linear, so when Ibuki is in the right space to get through them, she often does. This is a problem that comes up with any character whose attacks basically all hit very much in front of them. And since Ibuki can throw after Kazumigake when she gets to the other side of you, it doesn't help, because then Abigail has very few ways of dealing with this altogether. He does have one really odd one though, a very helpful option select. If you just think Ibuki's coming at you, just do light Abigail punch. Why will this work? Because if you do it wrong, you will get like giant flip. And Ibuki is one of the characters that spends more time than nearly any other putting herself slightly forward when she attacks. She can use this to reach people that are normally hard to hit. But because she's also such an active character, sometimes that light Abigail punch is all you really need. You can bait it, and you can get a decent amount of damage out of baiting it too, but if you find yourself spending time baiting like Abigail punch, you are definitely not doing what most of Ibuki players want to do in this matchup or think is a good idea. The worst part is, the move isn't even all that easy to get out of. Abigail can absolutely afford to just play the raw damage game against this character because of what I mentioned before. Ibuki has a certain amount of resources available to take down any opponent, and Abigail generally lives through it. Especially if there's no neutral at the beginning of the round. That's probably the worst situation Ibuki can be in. She hasn't managed to jump in, she hasn't managed any neutral, she hasn't landed a single extra hit other than having to throw a kunai, because throwing kunai does not count because she never gets any chance to recharge them, and still has to manage to beat this character. You can do it if you've built up enough meter and decided, well, I guess I'll do it differently next time or something. But other than that, you're pushing really hard on your character's output against a character who can armor through nearly everything you do and has practically an option select defense to your best deception. You do have to train quite a lot on the I am now going to throw you out of stuff, therefore. But there is the option to just win by that. Unfortunately, again, you look at that health amount. That health amount is exactly where every other character in this game would be down. Except maybe Zangief. And at least you could outmaneuver Zangief. Part of what is confusing about this is actually that Light Abigail Punch doesn't take that long to recover. It's easy to think of Abigail's Punch as a move where there's a problem and you have to think about it, but if Abigail whiffs Abigail Punch completely, by the time you realize that's what's happened, unless you were setting up a whiff punish for the move, you're not going to get him most of the time. It's similar to Ryu just doing light uppercut in neutral, which we suggest as a part of the Alex matchup. Yeah, you could, but Alex isn't actually availed of quite enough moves that you can go, oh, that was a light uppercut that I wasn't expecting. Let me quickly deal with this. So, simply put, rather than give yourself a bunch of different, complex, perfect reactions, just quarter circle forward light punch. You'll get either crouching light punch, Abigail punch, or light giant flip, which is not actually going off the ground at all and is still, I believe, at least neutral, if not plus. So, but now we're on to a technical match, a usually highly technical match because it's a lot of getting through zoning for the Abigail side. In this case, Abigail is playing Ibuki's role, trying to get some damage before the zoning can truly begin, mostly by hitting stand heavy kick, sometimes timing a good run into avalanche, but usually not at round start, and learning how to make the opponent think about things positionally that don't actually make sense in other matchups. For example, when Abigail jumps in this matchup, it might be good to just hit a fairly early medium punch, because you don't actually want to land a jump in on G, you just want G to not anti-air you. One of the other things that really matters here is the fact that G has just enough multi-hit moves that if you just straight run at him with armor, you have to think about whether or not you want to parry out of that armor. Which is a good mix-up from that side altogether. Still worked out, but there was probably a forgetful moment in there.
Round 2. Fight.
The other thing Abigail tends to need a lot of in this matchup is proper use of the meter, usually for offensive V reversal, and G in turn wants to jump forward out of a lot of weird situations that he normally defends in. To the point where you should think of a lot of things as almost jump cancels. G is, again, a character that's similar to Ibuki, often manages to bring down smaller characters pretty heavily just by output, but has to work a little harder to deal with Abigail fully. Still, a good defensive timing, figuring out when in the match to shift to defense, is a good option from G's side. Because you can play fairly heavy offense to start, especially if Abigail doesn't do anything too crazy or you have enough meter. And then after getting Abigail to the point where you have to worry about the V-trigger, then you just start playing a little more defensively and force Abigail players to set up the situation, fish for it, or use the V-trigger in ways that don't help as much. One thing that does help Abigail's side is the fact that G can be fairly suppressed in terms of the zoning game just by Abigail's overall reach. There are many situations where you might think, oh, I should throw out this attack, G-ball, G-burst, because in a normal zoning situation my opponent can't jump at me and they can't get around this either, but Abigail will just take a heavy punch in some form and you'll find yourself possibly trading, which is not what you want at all. In fact, it can take so long to get out of Abigail's range that G has to spend a lot more time on defense than most players are used to. There's the offensive V reversal, keep in the corner position, and again, back into that whole I get to do stuff. Now here we have what is normally a near shutdown situation, but G has to now instead go through a bunch of stuff relative to throws and setups and other things, because this time presidentiality is not going to be enough to get that win instantly. There would have to be pressure involved. Being able to fight at that range also helps Abigail because G has to either empty jump, and often something important to remember is that certain characters, when they empty jump from their zoning jump position, can't actually throw you right after. It's important as an Abigail player, you more so an Abigail player, to know this, because Abigail's parry can parry from much, let's call it, higher up. And the opponent must therefore do their jump a little differently, but it also means they're always in a situation where they might land in front of you and not be able to get anything off the empty jump by actually going for the throw. Understanding who can and can't do this really helps, but here's some more freestyling.
Of all the people of Earth, I have felt your power.
Final round. Fight.
G as a character doesn't generally have the option to do it. He can hang in the air, he can misdirect you about it, but the jump-ins themselves, he'd have to jump in with the opportunity to hit a button and always give it up. Specifically, jumping from close range, risking being anti-air, and yet not hitting the air button. Otherwise, you're gonna have to put up with parry. Unfortunately, G has enough air superiority against everything except Abigail's jumping medium punch that the two don't really have much air interactions that matter. Combo drop.
G wins.
The perfect space for Abigail to stand therefore is just outside of G's sweep range. It's at exactly the point where you can't really risk using the G burst. You would probably get parried if you jumped with the button, or just anti-aired normally in a lot of cases.
Round one.
You can't backdash out of everything from there. There's just a lot of spacing benefits to being at exactly that spot. And if you're not quite there, and you do get hit by the sweep, it's not usually terribly crippling for the matchup. G's best option at that range is oddly to dash, because it isn't a match where Abigail is thinking about the opponent dashing up. G shouldn't necessarily play this match all that aggressively in that sense. He has enough other options and enough other moves that dash up, throw, or dash up command grab are not really high on your list of things you need to spend your time doing. But it's precisely because of that that it ends up in that space. Because you have to add one thing that makes your opponent unsure about your state of mind and intentions when you're playing a match as, let's call it simplistic as this one. You can see it right there. G can absolutely jump in, do things, and use that range and that perfect thing to hit, but you know. Nope. I feel I was both sides getting their expectations broken a little bit. You can back throw Abigail out of that charge, but there is a spacing at which it won't work. And similarly, you can pretty much guess that that's the spacing that Mara had to learn. Abigail bot, if input even close to correctly, will give you a chance to practice throwing Abigail of that. But with enough presidentiality built up like completely, this is basically G's game to lose. It's very difficult to mess this up from here and not manage to make it. This is why it's so useful to actually get the parry, because the Abigail punch that follows the parry, and pretty much anything else honestly, is a knockdown that will reduce G's presidentiality, meaning that he can't jump in without risking loss of that ability.
Let's do this.
I'm president of the...
Round one. Fight!
Of all the people of Earth, I have felt your power.
Round two. Fight!
Pardon me. Please leave now. Power to the Earth! Light it up. I have the power. It's over.
G wins. Round one. Fight!
One of the hard things about this matchup is understanding a specific aspect of fighting games that doesn't come up until you're approximately this far in, actually. The reason why this is difficult for Akuma is that Akuma gets much less benefit from knockdowns than usual. The reason for that is because G is one of the few characters who can take the entire pushback of nearly every one of Akuma's Mikis and still be in a better situation than Akuma.
G wins.
Which means you must almost always end up taking some risk to do this, using weird meaties in the situation, or doing tick throws, more or less. There are other, of course, even more risky things you can do beyond tick throwing, but it's probably never come up before. One of the main reasons that that match becomes difficult is that Suntear isn't able to get much off of knockdowns. The knockdowns happen, but G just blocks through them. And this is another thing you can learn from the defensive side for your own character. In any given matchup, if you were to just block until your opponent finished their pressure, whether it be fast or slow or long, short, if they never take a step, if they never have to walk or try to throw you, are you better off at the end of their pressure, or are they? Despite Akuma having quite good walk speed, if you've got good enough throw defense, he doesn't have any command grabs, he doesn't have any really instant special evasion tricks that don't leave him in bad situations, etc. So it's mostly just, I'll just defend, I'll wake up, and you won't break me.
Fight.
This is the opposite, so let's see how it goes.
Round 2. Fight.
Now we got Freestylin in the corner. This is a strange matchup sometimes because Mika doesn't actually have pressure good enough to lock G down in the corner most of the time.
Fight.
If she gets a knockdown in the corner, things will go great. But just actually, G can back off to the corner and stick there for quite a while without caring about it. But this actually means that advancing on him isn't all that necessary, and you've already seen Just Fine begin the correct adaptation. It's just, I'll just hype. This is further compounded by the fact that G can also take the reaction to Just Hype too, but Mika will win in this situation. If they both stand there talking for long enough, this will go her way in almost every actual interaction. This is because all of Mika's throws take advantage of this. It's not something that many people understand because it's not necessarily super intuitive, and it's hard to see the effect sometimes. But do bear it in mind, every single throw, normal throws, command throws, and wingless airplane all benefit from this move. And the fact that G's dash is slightly slow and his command grab even slower means that his options for making Mika not do that are limited. He doesn't have no options, but he doesn't have great ones. He requires a lot of presidentiality, and that's the main thing he should be spending his time doing when Mika decides to give herself the hype. Building up enough presidentiality to stop her from doing it again. And then trying to play it out so that she doesn't get knocked over. Here, for example, now the situation is okay for G, but only if he doesn't get knocked down within the next 2 interactions. And, as you can see, it's not terribly difficult to get somewhere. However, he did get more meters, so he's back where we started. If this is a fight of guts, Mika has more guts than G. The situation, however, gets a little worse when Mika's cornered in this specific way. I did not think I was going to go through that way. Learn something every day. Surprisingly, one of G's better options when Mika decides to do that is to dash and then do nothing.
Round 1.
But whether or not this works is a lot dependent on spacing. Dashing and then doing nothing puts G in a situation that's very slightly better for him than it is for her, and removes a certain temptation to do a particular move type that she can get through more easily. But as you just see, guts, there's lots of it. Mika is at least 50% guts. With B-Trigger 2, this is going to be a little harder, especially because it doesn't grant any additional presidentiality, meaning that Mika still has control of the corner game quite a lot. One of the things G suffers from the most is the fact that his moves don't give him enough invincibility on Wake Up to get away from meaty microphone. Which is not something you'd normally think of using, but the character is one of the few where this will work, and often it works really well in the corner. But now we've got a good matchup, presidentiality, and it doesn't really matter that a lot of meter was used up, a huge life advantage was achieved, and still enough of it to keep going. Again, G doesn't really care so much about the corners, so it's going to come down to something like this. Yep. Remember people, life leads aren't real. That, however, is... Would have had to be really ready with that particular wingless airplane timing, which was unlikely given everything else that was happening. A little hasty on the wake up, and that has probably put her in a fairly bad situation because there's no good way to convert the meter now other than doing that. Offensive V reversal is not a strong option for Mika in this matchup most of the time though, so there's a lot of walking down, avoiding wheel kick, and so on. This is generally the point where she has to use more of her crouch heavy punch, but it will leave her open to a lot of options she has. Still, it will also set up situations where it's easier to get the wingless timing. Ooh, not enough, but that was...
Mika wins.
Well, so far so good on the saga of Just Vine's Weird Internet. And that brings us back to this matchup. I'm probably not going to have much to say this time. I've almost exhaustively spoken about little nuances of it, and it doesn't make it any easier to understand it. Particularly when the players have such a strong idea of how the other want to play. Just Fine may have switched to using her second V skill against this character sometimes, but not today. Oh, well, yeah, I can see why, because generally against the wolf you wouldn't want it. Against Cosmic Wolf you might want it. But the basics for those watching at home, Nikali really just needs to walk around and hit stand medium punch. And Mika needs to be very, very good at spacing certain things at neutral and then go ham when she can get in close enough and doesn't care about being hit by Rising Light. Any off spacings at all and she's going to be in trouble. Because Nikali's movement will only get better as we go. Since Mika is also not a character that benefits a whole lot from the jump in this matchup, she has to be a lot more ready with either a command grab or crouch jab to check the opponent and the wingless airplane itself. Fortunately, these have similar inputs, so you can play a sort of twitchy from the forward stance and then slide to back when you need it. The rest is a matter of knowing which confirm to use based on the space you're in.
Round 2.
The punishes that Mika can give and the position she gets out of properly punishing things Nikali does means that Nikali can't afford to take as many risks. He'll get reset back to the same position where he had taken the last risk and have to do it again. The same thing goes for the jump-ins. But at least mixing them all up might get you somewhere. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. She's much better at, I've hit you at all, now I'm converting a bunch of stuff. But I have a strong feeling this is going to come down to a command grab. Which side? I don't know. Nikali does have a tendency to stick buttons into her command grab range, but only the EX and only with nearly perfect timing. And whiff punish command grab is not one of the things you spend a lot of time doing in this game.
Mika wins. Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight. Final round. Fight. Mika wins.
If you didn't understand before what I meant by freestyling, you do now. So once again, we are denied the Wolf versus Wolf, Necalli versus Necalli mirror match. There are many other streams where this comes up, don't worry about it.
Let's do this. Round 1. Fight.
The neutral parry, as you're seeing it, is actually slightly more for intimidation. Because think about it, if you spend a lot of time hitting buttons in neutral, particularly ones that would be parries, and you are trying to hit them at max range, it's your only button. So if you wait for it and then hit it, you're fine if you're waiting to bait it out. But if you're having a frenzied match, your opponent just walking up to you or dashing up to you and parrying isn't going to have the same effect unless you're really practiced. The other use for the move is completely different. Mika can dash up parry in a lot of situations, as well as when she gets herself put into that whole have been hit by a couple of heavy kicks situation. The pushback on Nikali's heavy kick is something that Cosmic Wolf uses quite well to control the opponent's wish to move. Because often, if you try to get out of the way of this move, you will get hit. If you try to do anything against it, you're at a range where none of your buttons are going to work, and it's a heavy. It's similar, very similar to Chun-Li hitting that heavy punch. There's too many situations where the fast button you have that could do the job won't. Simply because it'll be slightly off, you have to be perfect. It'll be a heavy against your medium or something. There's too many risks involved. Crush counters are a big deal. The move is quite whiff punishable, but only if you can make the opponent miss. And generally, Cosmic Wolf doesn't miss with the stand heavy kick unless stressed. What this allows Mika as a character to do is walk up into more favorable situations more often. Not all the way up to get any grabs much really or anything, but definitely enough to manipulate the flow of the match. You can also see for good reason why the additional use of the reversal to control this space to just keep the same situation happening over and over again would be helpful. Even though the reversals are getting blocked, it's just recreating the same thing over and over, and more stress is being added. And that'll reach. And you might think, well, just don't hit the second heavy kick, but that's what Cosmic Wolf is already doing. And it's really important to think about this sort of thing in your playstyle. If your opponent does something that would counter a skill you have or a option you use a lot of people will tell you, oh well, just don't use that then, without realizing that a lot of other aspects of your playstyle rely on you being able to do that. Your opponent has shut you down at least a little bit. Not hitting the second heavy kick is a big deal. In general, Cosmic Wolf will begin to retreat under these circumstances, and it's not something Just Vine normally enjoys dealing with, but she has enough tools to get away with most of what's required. However, with this V skill she can't build up anything from doing so, and is often forced to just walk down, or use her crouch heavy punch to try to get an advantage. One of her better options is actually to backdash herself. Because it sets up a situation in which the jump can happen if Cosmic Wolf tries to come forward again. This is more so psychological. If your opponent keeps on backing away from you because they think you're going to keep coming to them, just don't. Backing off yourself when you realize they've gotten to exactly the spot on the screen that I want them to do that. They'll stop and make a different attack or make an approach. The different attack will help. The approach also helps. And finally, finding yourself in the position where the jump forward while expecting Nakali's approach will hit. Just Fine is already on the ball and doing so. If your character doesn't have a cross-up, it's not actually required. If they don't have a cross-up but they have a command grab, even better. Just jump to the other side and go for your EX if necessary. The only character I think that doesn't manage this easily is Zangief, but Zangief doesn't run into this situation because he can hit with Lariat, he can parry certain things, he can get over situations better, and he just doesn't care as much as a generality. Here we have a match that these two don't play often. Mika doesn't have a lot of situational responses to being dashed around. She doesn't have a good neutral jumping cross-up that Ibuki will fall prey to. And one of her better options is a really complicated input. Specifically, when she thinks something weird is going to happen in neutral, of any type, against this character, her best option is to hit what is effectively a backwards Shoryuken motion, and then do her command grab. Why? Because there's a bunch of situations in which doing exactly that and mashing a button, if you're not familiar, when a character crosses to the other side of you, the game does actually reverse your inputs. So if you're trying to do a half circle back and your opponent happens to cross behind you at a certain point, you end up doing down forward, down forward. You can see this in our Kage bot. It's actually, unfortunately, part of the requirements for the input that you learn that this works this way. So, if you think nonsense or shenanigans are going to happen in neutral and your opponent's going to try to get to your other side, doing the down back on Mika gives you the highest chance of landing something. You see, Just Fine automatically go into throw stance, which is also really good for it, because the worst that will happen, because again the game is very lenient about some very strange things, is that if you're holding down at the moment things happen, you'll end up throwing, and so on. So technically, it's down back,
You lose.
sorry, back, down, back, throw, and then go for your command grab as an entirely separate motion. And the reason this is important is because if your opponent did cross you up, but not in the timing you think, the way you can finish the command grab is shorter.
Round one.
This is just a really complicated input trick that I probably would not have mentioned on another stream. But this is Freestylin, so if you're here, you're probably looking for crazy stuff. Other than that, you can just play neutral normally, more or less. An even greater benefit of this is that doing this motion means you're always ready for weakness. And because Mika's options in neutral are quite good in the same way, she can just hit crouch, medium kick, and so on. The main thing to do is to try not to become too defensive while learning this. Because you've got other options, you can go on the attack. If your opponent is not spending a lot of time dashing to your other side anyway, you don't care about any of this, just play the match. But if you are finding yourself in those situations in neutral where you can't get to where you need to be and you're not sure whether or not she's going to go flicking around the place, this covers most of your options, similar to that weirdness that we talk about in Guilty Gear, going up against Leo's cross-ups. In fact, it's actually very similar in terms of how you press it, so if you're familiar with one from another game, you can pull it in. This works for any character with a half circle back command grab, but is less helpful for nearly everyone else because the types of move required for it don't come out the same. In fact, it's downright risky to use this if your character has a very punishable uppercut. The good part about it though is that you're not really supposed to try too hard to think about how to execute it perfectly. It's specifically something that's supposed to work because it's not executed perfectly. Neither you nor your opponent really knows what's about to happen.
You lose.
And this puts them in a situation of a lot of mix-ups in this game rely on your opponent intimidating you into thinking something is going to happen. If you are actually random, their success rate goes down. Their goal is to get you to go, okay, I need to block, I need to do this, and I need to do this, and then break that expectation either by spacing or using an invincible move or some other trickery, so that the sensible thing to do isn't actually the thing you need to do, but because they try to put you into the situation over and over, you can't just be doing the risky thing every time. Eventually you'll put yourself in a bad situation some other way and possibly take even more damage. Ibuki is basically the embodiment of that, because she's not actually pressuring you, so to speak, she's just quickly moving to the opposite side and seeing if you can react to it. Therefore, if you do crazier reactions that happen to hit quite hard, or at least not fail spectacularly, especially if your opponent can't tell that you were trying something crazy when it fails, then
Round one.
they could relatively quickly become discouraged about the whole thing. In this matchup, Mika benefits quite a bit from both her drop kick and her standard popping medium kick. This is not because Abigail has a particular weakness to either of these moves, but because they have deceptive range and help with things like whiff punches. Abigail has a specific range that he's trying to hit you from, and that range is one where Mika can use other options as with punishes, purely because, again, Abigail's moves animate for quite a long time.
Round two. Fight.
Abigail's bigger benefit in these situations, therefore, is to not spend much time using heavy buttons, but more so rely on mediums. And when the opponent seems to be coming for anything else, just prepare to parry. Similar to how Jury is fought, but with parry instead of the ES Abigail punch. For the same reason as explained before with Mika's parry. Abigail can, for the most part, just parry and neutral at max range without expecting much dangerous or terrible things to happen. Mika's crush counter is a long animation that might whiff, or a not particularly far forward animation where if Abigail was parrying because he expected something like a hop, won't reach anyway. With the bigger problem being that the whiff parry leads to a slightly advantageous situation in terms of timing for me, more so than the Abigail is likely to take a ton of damage for doing it. This is compounded by Abigail just being able to parry out of the run, because it forces Mika, in most of her movements, to get ready to throw Abigail instead, or jump back at the right timing to counter the run some other way. And unfortunately, she is another one of those characters that gets hit when they try to back jump if an avalanche is used. Not as often as Kali is, but she definitely takes the hit more often than not. forward jump will avoid the avalanche as you've just seen, but leads to basically no damage from her side. Yes, it's made that Abigail waste to beat her, but he didn't really need to use the EX avalanche in the first place, so that's not quite the same sort of win.
Push it to the red level.
Round 2. Fight.
How's that? How's that?
The reason people teach players not to just parry a lot in neutral and guess is because until you're good enough to make your opponent not hit a ton of buttons in neutral, most likely what will happen when you attempting to parry is that you'll somehow mistime it, and your opponent, who was probably attacking anyway, will hit you. But once you've gotten to a level of the game where your opponent isn't super confident in attacking constantly, you get to add this layer to the game. Just sometimes parry just raw random. If your opponent is waiting for that, then they're not necessarily stopping you from hitting buttons instead. Please note this is not as good on Ryu because Ryu's buttons don't reach in the correct way. Unfortunately. You can use it with fireballs if you're really conscientious, but overall it is not a Ryu thing to do because Abigail can reach, Gil can reach fairly easily, Alex can reach. Those characters all have a large amount of space between them and the opponent that they can enforce by hitting specific buttons, get pushback, and not be in danger. Akuma can do this to some extent as well, but Akuma's parry isn't as all-encompassing and also has a longer animation, so you do tend to get hit or dash thrown or something. So yes, for characters other than Ryu, this can work out quite well. This is partially, and I expect, why they gave Ryu the thrust parry that he has for his V skill 2, because that move will in fact do that job. Because he can do the thrust parry from very far out, and if you happen to hit a button, one thing happens, and if you don't, he's probably still alright. Unless you jumped.
Round 1. Fight.
This is oddly another weird match where it's harder to get benefits from any specific form of sustained attack, and a lot of what Suntier ends up having to do will probably revolve around hitting stand, light kick, and things like that. It's a part of the game that doesn't come up until you play very specific characters played by specific skill levels of player. The need for Akuma to hit stand light punch and stand light kick in specific situations to create the correct pushback, create the correct interaction, and so on. Because it doesn't come up, you end up facing off with characters whose game plan revolves around that themselves, specifically Mika, Sakura, other higher level Akuma, I guess. Someone else I can't think of right now. Who just spend a lot of time hitting a relatively long range light kick. Specifically with the intent of putting you in that situation. Karine can hit her light kick, but it doesn't create the same setup. Only people like Punk do that.
Final round.
Oh, it's Lara, right, obviously. She just does it less often. The light kick in particular is most useful because it creates a pushback that favors Akuma. A lot. So in nearly every other situation where the opponent is probably going to at least try to get their turn, hitting medium punch twice is good, hitting crouch heavy punch into stuff is good. A lot of the time you want to go for the light kick after other stuff in this matchup because what you want is more so the positioning than the chance of damage. Against other characters, the two come together. You hit crouch medium punch twice, the pushback favors you. The opponent doesn't have any crazy stuff they can do from there, and if they backdash, they don't have a quick way to immediately respond to, say, a Hadouken.
Round one.
Mika isn't that character. She has all these options. So what you want is a very small pushback with the light kick. It checks a bunch of situations and puts you where you want to be more often. This is a hard thing to get used to because understanding that certain characters end up at different spaces and therefore you need to use different buttons to control those spaces, while intuitive enough, doesn't often feel like it matters in terms of the specific characters you see. It's easier to think of those things in terms of situations. This person keeps blocking, so I want to do this. This person keeps going for this move instead of what I expect, so I need to do this. It's less often seen as just an overall character trait that you manipulate purely because, hey, my opponent's playing Mika, I should do this. One other place you're likely to see this is in matches against Zaku. Because while Zaku is very good at zoning, he also has to do a specific amount of mid-range control in space to get damage. Because your opponent really can't just hang out there and let you zone them. So if you play a character like Mika or Lara, you should spend a lot of time thinking about when and why you hit your lights, standing lights in particular in neutral, because they poke at a bunch of things Zaku does, sometimes getting good damage, but you don't really have to worry about them being punished. If you just hit the button and block, nearly every move Zaku does, you are just as ready to defend against that move after having done that as you were before. They take so long that you didn't really put yourself at risk by using light kick or light punch.
Final round. Fight.
There you see exactly the perfect demonstration of it. By changing the pushback just a little, it was impossible for Mika to do most of the things she would normally do right then. And while that wasn't a conversion into damage or a really strong way of getting in a good situation from Suntier's side, it still definitely helped a bit.
Mika wins.
Learning to do your invincible move after the first hit of your opponent's meaty string is very important. This is particularly strong against characters that don't have command grabs and whose lights don't easily reach in the same spaces.
Let's do this.
Well, it seems like we're probably coming to the end of this stream, not necessarily the lounge, but the lounge is full, so anyone looking around on it, we just had one more person join. You shouldn't expect to have a slot, but we tend to drift out around this time, especially since those who have been playing for a while aren't always likely to stick around to wait through all the other matches to get their last match. Which means if you join within, let's say, 20 minutes, you might get your own match sooner than you think. But here we go into Zangief versus Mika, which could often seem as if it's a big muscle showdown, but depending on how Mika chooses to play it, she wins this fairly handily if you know enough about how Zangief works. And Zangief bot is practiced exactly this way, meaning that it's fairly easy to do. The main thing that helps from the Zangief side is that he has at least comparable, if not better, footsies, and doesn't have to worry so much about the specifics of his conversions. If you're not used to the throw mix-up get-out game though, and things like your own instant wake-up, EX, air SPD, you'll find yourself in situations like this, where you've got situations that help you, but you're going to have to work harder than you'd probably expect to have to work. The flex is a good help in this situation, but the problem with this is that if you flex from too far away, Mika will just use the mic, and then you have to worry because your life lead doesn't matter as much anymore. Zangief has the reach to get to her, but again, it mostly depends on whether or not she's playing defensively or not. These matches can be very drawn out if they're not super explosive. Mika's options for whiff punishing Zangief are much better than Zangief's options for whiff punishing Mika, leading to basically this sort of situation. So, while you normally hate to tell anyone, hey, you probably need to learn some hard execution before you even think of a certain way to play this matchup, this is one of those few matchups in this game. If you can't do certain things as Zangief, and your opponent is relatively even in strength to you, you're not going to get far without understanding a whole lot of like UT theory. At least not against any Mika who has trained to move in and out of Zangief's threat ranges.
Final round. Fight.
And for us that's easy because Kata 31. Right. Kata 31 is basically almost entirely about this, and it doesn't require any changes to the bot. So you're just fighting Zangief bot with slightly different intent. Usually helpful because you've probably done so before. He's also one of those characters where it's fairly easy to get used to all the things he does, precisely because he doesn't do that many, and some are, let's say, gated behind others. If you learn enough of the game plan for this matchup, you can get a lot done. But it's really rough if you can't do a certain thing. Specifically two certain things, actually. As even that can technically be reversaled and it will still work.
Zangief wins.
Fortunately at this point, Mika's probably not going all out. And Just Fine is therefore likely to go for a more measured approach that Zangief does deal with, which doesn't involve a ton of her main advantage in the matchup. Her main advantage in the matchup is that she can just slide. She can slide in a lot of situations. Because once you have the slide, the jump, and everything else put together, it starts to once again stress Zangief's flow. And any moment of retreat, especially with this, the skill on Mika's side, means that she'll rack up more throw damage.
Round 2. Fight.
You can find all the bots and katas in question at our website 2-mk.org. Bots are under bots. Specifically, Street Fighter V bots are under bots because they were the first bots we made. But you can also, if for some reason you need to, type sfv-bots. For other games, you can find them the other way. You type in the generally used acronym of that game. There are no bots for Guilty Gear because of how their system works, and the bots for DOA aren't that helpful because of how their system works.
Final round.
One of the worst aspects of this matchup, however, is Mika's ability to build up large amounts of throw damage using her B skill and then force the command grab. As you can see, while Zangief can get into position, it's a little hard. So you have to be oppressive enough that there's basically nothing she can do. And as soon as you switched your mindset toward, okay, I can't walk backwards, I can't play this way, or she'll start to do this, then you have to deal with things like charge, drop kick into command grab. Being ready for that is itself a whole problem. This is further compounded by something that I have no name for, but simply playing a match in which the same 2 or 3 moves get used over and over. You sort of know what's going on, and then your opponent just suddenly does one of the other moves from their arsenal. It's not even that the move is used incorrectly, it's that there wasn't a position for it before, and so it went out of your mind space for a while. And then suddenly, here it is again. It's in the correct place. They're not just throwing this out randomly or taking random chances. They're doing the correct move. It's just that you basically forgot about it, because it hasn't come up in so long. Mika has a lot more options for this than Zangief does. Zangief has to get closer to do anything surprising most of the time, whereas Mika can do surprising things a lot. Ah, she dropped the moment. Maybe not. The other thing is you can hold that for quite long if your opponent happens to not be walking forward at the moment you start it. Therefore, it could be in your best interest as the Mika player to choose the timing for the B skill but not be watching your own character when you do it. Because the only thing you care about is how far away Zangief is. He has a couple good options to get to you, but most of them you can hold the mic for fairly long, and if the opposing player for any reason flinches, the situation tends to get fairly bad for them.
Final round. Fight.
See here that Just Fine keeps on going for the max range and then the block strength. This is partially because Zangief is one of the few characters that doesn't have to respect Mika's command grab option in that situation once he has full meter. He can actually just respond to after blocking drop kicks with super, which is a big deal. That was an interesting interaction to end the night on, I guess.
Mika wins.
But that brings us to the end of this freestyle. The lounge seems to have lightened up, as noted, so you can join in. It'll probably stay open maybe for another half an hour, but possibly tomorrow you can join us for Under Night, and on Thursday for Dead or Alive 6 60 times. We don't expect any other content at the moment. So this has been Rillian, 142MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.